I'm sitting in the sanctuary of Old Kingsport Presbyterian Church, the oldest church in Kingsport, at least its organization, and it goes back to 1820. It was called the Boatyard Congregation, and it was not of any particular denomination. It was, this building dates from 1852. The original building was a log structure down near the river, and folks of any denomination were welcome, and it was not organized by any one denomination. And so you'd find the Baptist, and you can find their little cemetery on the other side of the railroad track from Netherland Inn. The Methodists, people who later called themselves Methodists, or Anglican, or anything else, non-denominational, and of course Presbyterian. So over time, the Presbyterians, there were more of them, or at least they contacted the presbytery, which was located up in Abingdon, and sought to be organized as a Presbyterian church. And that's where the 1820 date comes from. The church was built, its benefactor, his portrait's on the back there's Dr. Frederick Ross, and he inherited after his father's death a number of slaves, and on his way coming down here to receive his inheritance, he had a number of his dad's slaves were in Lynchburg area. He freed them all. This is before the Civil War. Gave them 40 acres. Came down here, and he was well-to-do, and he was an outspoken person, and did things differently. Tennessee had a law, as did Virginia, that you could not teach slaves to read and write. He ignored that, and the evidence is up in the slave balcony. And he also was very concerned about the foments of war, and at his own expense, he went up to Buffalo, New York to try to persuade the abolitionists to back down, that eventually, I agree with you, but let's do this, gradually so we don't have a war. And of course, he didn't succeed. And then eventually, he freed his slaves here. And he, of course, made some bad investments, tried to invested in the Mulberry silk factory, and that went under, and a couple other ones. And a tragedy of Rotherwood, where he lived, was his daughter was married there, but on the night before the wedding, the groom, I think he drowned. And that really upset his daughter and himself, the whole family. And wasn't too long after that, his health went down. He ended up, she moved to Alabama, married someone else, and so he left the area. The Presbyterian Church was splitting theologically and over the slavery issue. And this church waited 6 months before they voted which side they were going to go with. They went with the northern side, and they waited 6 months in hopes of keeping the membership, but they lost folks. But the core of the church that remains was a northern Presbyterian church. And their orientation was such that when Dr. Ross, before he left, he said, if this church ever ceases to be of that northern theological new school orientation, the property will revert to his heirs. And so even while I was here, there was some property that the church was wanting to give for Habitat Humanity down here. And the church elders, session, presbytery, they hired a lawyer, and he had to search to find a descendant of Dr. Ross, elderly lady out in Missouri, where she gave her permission, and they put everything in the paper for 90 days, whatever such. And then the church was able to sell that land or give it away. But the church has kept their word. They have always been a northern church. So even in some of the ways that the northern church operated, they have kept. Like when I was being looked at as a candidate, the Southern Church doesn't allow you to meet the future candidate. Only a committee, pastor nominating committee, gets to meet them. And that way the church doesn't get enamored and torn up over them. So, oh, they're wonderful. The Northern Church, no. They get to meet the congregation. You get to do a trial sermon right there in front of the potential congregation. And that's what happened with me. Then I knew this was a Northern Church still in its ways. And the rupture of the churches was not healed until 1983. And that's when the North and South came back together. The people who left here, some of which, and others, they started what's now called First Presbyterian Church in the New Kingsport, the model city, and they date from 1917. But this church was known as First Presbyterian Church until 1948, and bless their hearts, the confusion, you'd have to put the whole UPC USA, this was the Northern, and the other one, and so this church was never as large, of course, as the other. So they relented and let the church circle one have First Presbyterian. But people who know their history know that's really not true. It is not the First Presbyterian Church of Kingsport. The First Presbyterian Church, PCUS, Southern, Confederate, yes. First Presbyterian Church of Kingsport, no, it is right here. And the railroad had come through thanks to George L. Carter and J. Fred Johnson. And the church was so close to the railroad that you'd be having services and boom, you couldn't hear. And the church faced south at that point. When they moved it in 1953, changed the orientation and it faces north, which is its real orientations too. And the architect was from Knoxville, Dr. Ross hired him, and the folks who moved it said they would be so careful that you could put a glass of water and it wouldn't spill. And one of the church members took them up on it, bought a 5-cent Coke, took the cap off and set it in one of the windows, and sure enough, it was still sitting there. They had to stop the railroad. There were no trains coming, no cars or nothing, and it took them, a while to do it. But sure enough, they didn't knock that Coke over. Yeah, Diana Ross, the Motown singer, is a famous person tied to this church. Her great-great-grandfather, Albert, was one of the freed slaves, but sat up in the balcony. And Dr. Ross said of him in his own records that he was the handsomest man in all the land, black or white, and that he had a wonderful baritone voice. Diana's father, even closer, was a member of this church. And James Ross, and of course the last name comes from Dr. Frederick Ross, but that connection is right here in this church.